Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's here in the parish hall. Thank you to everyone who's joining us by Zoom. And thank you to Jay Mallon, our technician, who's going to keep in touch with the Zoom audience. I'm going to ask Ann Dursey, our Minister for Community Engagement and Deacon, to give us an opening prayer, and then I'll be back to introduce our three speakers.
Good morning, everyone. The Lord be with you. O God of many names, we come to you as always with hearts grateful for all the blessings that you have given us. We thank you especially this morning for this gathering and for all who have joined in it, seeking peace and an end to the death and pain caused by senseless gun violence. We remember, we lament, and we mourn all those who have died, all those who have suffered from the scourge of violence by firearms. We ask that you give us the wisdom, the guidance, the inspiration to help us seek peace, to help us be those that bring an end to this scourge in our nation. As always, we look to you as the peacemaker. Inspire us today in our discussions, and we thank you especially for the work of our legislators, and we ask that you guide us in showing us how we can best support, work with them, work with everyone who's devoted to this important cause. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Thank you for that beautiful prayer, Ann. We're off to a great start. Thank you to our speakers. I'm going to say a few words about them. Senator Shelley Heddleman represents District 11 in Baltimore County, and she is sponsoring a bill to protect victims of domestic violence. In 2014, she was elected to the Maryland House of Delegates, and just a few years later, she received the Legislative Award from the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. In 2020, Governor Larry Hogan appointed her to the Senate, and she was reelected in 2022. She currently serves on several committees, including the Joint Committee on Children and Families. Delegate Bernice Miracu North is a licensed attorney, and she represents District 14, which is here in Montgomery County. And I think some of her constituents are here today. I hope so. From 2009 to 2015, she served as Assistant State's Attorney of Anne Arundel County. She later established her own law firm and worked as a criminal defense attorney. In 2023, Governor Larry Hogan appointed her to the House of Delegates, where she serves on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the right committee if we're talking about a tax. Karen Herron was legislative director of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence before she stepped into her current role as executive director. She has led advocacy efforts to pass major gun safety laws in recent years, including a stronger child access prevention law, Jay Lynn's law, the 2023 law, which prohibited firearms in schools, government buildings, and many other sensitive locations, and the Gun Industry Accountability Act, which passed in 2024. And Senator Heddleman is going to speak first, then Delegate Miracu North, and Karen Herron will speak last. So take it away, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me this morning. And I really appreciate your taking your time on a Sunday, on a cold, wintry day to venture out here. I really want to thank Karen and my colleague, Delegate Miracu North, for being here too. I'm very interested in hearing about the other bills that you will learn about this morning as well. And thank you so much to St. John's for hosting us here. Um, I One thing that is actually, I don't think it's even in my resume anywhere, but it kind of helps to inform much of my legislative work, is that I helped to start and get off the ground a domestic violence program almost 30 years ago in Baltimore. And it actually was focused on the Jewish community. And it was a partnership between the House of Ruth, which is a general community organization that provides a lot of very direct service, legal service, shelter, counseling services, extensive services for abusers as well, actually statewide. And a lot of what many pieces of legislation are informed by my work helping to get that program off the ground. And unfortunately, the program has only grown and expanded in the 30 years, really focused on intimate partner violence, and it actually has branched out to include some issues around child abuse and elder abuse. So some of what I'm going to talk about today, I also lived as a service provider below those many years ago, and some of you may be involved in those kinds of issues too. Many of you, I think, are, because I see the red T-shirts too, through the Moms Demand folks, and which is a wonderful organization that shows up in Annapolis, focused on gun violence, and that's really what this bill is about too, is keeping people safe. But you may not know as much about domestic violence. Do people been involved on issues of intimate partner violence? Some yeses, nos. So a lot of what is involved in domestic violence involves power and control. And a lot of times it happens behind closed doors. When I was doing this kind of work, I sometimes would come home and say, there are things that I'm learning about people that I don't want to know about people. And what's going on oftentimes in our homes, among people that we see in the grocery store, in church, in synagogue, in the world at large. And it always sort of struck me, how is it that people can behave one way behind closed doors and another way interacting in the community at large, whether they're at their place of employment or in the anywhere else. And so one of the things that unfortunately also that we know is that risks of gun violence in intimate partner homicide, homicide and the risk of harm to a victim goes up exponentially, and the risk of death goes up exponentially. Safety is, I think, the driving force behind what we're trying to do in this piece of legislation. It's keeping the community safe, and it's keeping the intimate partner safe and the family safe. We also know that it's not only abusers and people who use firearms in domestic violence don't only affect the person they're abusing. Mass casualties also, many of them have stemmed from intimate partner violence. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I don't know if you recall, actually it was a year ago, in January 2024, there was a judge in Glen Elg, a father, he was shot and killed. A Glen Elg father, I'm mixing up circumstances. A Glen Elg father shot and killed his 2 teenage children before turning the gun on himself. And in May, an Elk Ridge father shot and killed his wife, daughter-in-law, and adult daughter, and shot and injured his adult son before turning the gun on himself. In June, a 12-year-old Baltimore City girl was shot and killed by her mother's former intimate partner who had previously threatened the family. And the judge who was murdered, that was October 23rd, and that was by a shooter who was risking losing his children in his court. So that also had intimate partner violence as the impetus. And unfortunately, these kinds of circumstances are not uncommon. We do know that having a firearm in the home increases exponentially the chance of someone being harmed. So what we are trying to do is ensure that when people try to use the court system and the legal system to be safe from their abuser, that the legal system is taking into consideration that, that fact. Finding out whether there is a firearm. We want judges to be assertive in asking whether there is a firearm, even though there is a question on the form that one fills out in a civil protection order. We want there to be a little more initiative from the courts to ask. I'll just share a story that Judge Morrissey, who's the chief judge of the district courts in Maryland, shared. He served on the bench for many, many years, and he had someone before him who hadn't he was seeking a protection order, and he said, has this person hit you? Has this person done this to you? Has they, went through kind of a litany of different horrors that he hadn't heard from her. And then at some point, after hearing no, 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 and no firearm, in this case, he said, is there anything else? And she said, well, the time that he held a machete to my neck. And it sort of, I think, drove home the point that, he shouldn't have to go through and ask that, specific a question in order to tease out and find out what's actually happening. There are very complicated and challenging reasons why someone might not lead with that, right? So we need to be assertive and intentional and recognize the safety issues that people face when they do try to seek help from the legal system. We know from experience that trying to leave or trying to involve the legal system is the most dangerous point for someone who's trying to change the dynamic in a domestic violence relationship. And that changes the power dynamic, and it's much more dangerous for the person who's seeking help. So sometimes they are reticent, and if somebody's not going to be forthcoming, obviously that is very difficult, but we need to be sensitive to that and intentional in trying to get that information to provide the safety. So what we want to do through this bill is we want to change the relinquishment of a firearm and not make it discretionary for a judge. We want the judge to require the firearm relinquishment at each stage of a protection order. There are 3 different stages of getting a protection order. The first is called an interim. Somebody fills out a piece of paperwork. They go to a court. They could get a judge. They could get a commissioner. They tell what happened. They are heard. That person sends out a protection order. It has to be delivered and served by a law enforcement officer. Most of the time it's a sheriff. Sometimes it's the local police. And then that form requires that that respondent come into court before a judge, and both parties then present their set of facts and experiences. And then there is another hearing 7 days later for a final protection order. Our current law requires at the final protection order that the firearm be relinquished. It does not require it right now at the temporary stage or the interim stage. And so this bill would require at both of those stages that those firearms be relinquished when they are being used in a threatening manner to try to harm or threaten the individual. So we are hopeful that we will get some traction this year. One of the other things that we're talking about is how to ensure that this process happens. There are models around the country. 24 jurisdictions have 24 different methods of doing this. And so that makes this extremely challenging. In some places, it's the sheriff's office. In Montgomery County, actually, your local government is pretty intentional about it because you had a sheriff who thought this issue was very, very important, and he led the way and kind of developed some internal structures to ensure that the protection order was being delivered, to follow up if it wasn't, to sit down with the victim and explain what the process was, and so that they were fully aware of what their rights were at each step of the way, and to link them with services in the community, which also is a really, really important thing to do, with counseling services, with housing, with other kinds of services that they might need for their family. So it really does help to have a somebody who's interested in this issue, who understands the value of it, as part of the team. There are 30,000 plus hearings that are before our courts every year from people seeking protection orders. So we are going to work on trying to figure out that accountability piece and continue to face those challenges. The bottom line is we could use your help. I know folks here are going to talk about how you can be involved, but I will tell you your voice matters in Annapolis, and your advocacy matters. Reaching out to your local legislators and talking about why this is important. If you have personal experiences, it's always really important to share them if you are able and feel comfortable doing so. But you can, and I know it because I'm on the receiving end of those calls and letters, and certainly the ones from my district really, really matter the most, because we need to hear from you. So I thank you in advance for your interest and your activism, and look forward to partnering with you to continue to make our communities safer. Thank you.
Oops, I thought I was doing this right. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to St. John's for hosting this opportunity to converse with you today about our legislation, and special shout out to Senator Hellman. I just appreciate all her work in the domestic violence space, and her beyond judiciary is so critical for the work we're doing in Maryland to help all of us in dealing with domestic violence. And just again, thank you for your work. It's a great bill idea. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. So before I get into the bill, I wanted to explain a little bit of my why. So first of all, let me introduce myself again. Delegate Bernice American North. I represent District 14, which includes parts of Silver Spring, just north of White Oak, all the way through Olney, and then Burtonsville. There's also Laytonsville, Brookville, and we go all the way up to Damascus and Clarksburg. So it's a bit of a hodgepodge of communities. I see a lot of nodding heads, so you understand. I'm in my first term as a member of the House of Delegates, so just very fortunate to serve with my colleagues, Senator Craig Zucker, Delegate Ann Kaiser, and Delegate Pam Queen have been wonderful and longtime servants of Maryland. So, so a little bit about my why, about why I decided to do this bill. So most of you are from Montgomery County. So I served on the Montgomery County's Reimagining Public Safety Task Force a few years ago, it seems like. And it was around October of 2020 when I was serving that I had my own personal near tragedy regarding gun violence. My father was shot in Washington, D.C., just sitting in his car. He survived. And then there was another gentleman, maybe like a couple miles away, that was also shot, but he did not survive. So if you think of it in context, I was going through a situation where I was trying to deal with criminal justice reform and have my own tragedy to deal with. So it really was a light bulb as to how to really be intentional in the reform process and not just talk the talk, but actually create solutions that make meaningful change. And so going through that process of my father healing, you know, the notion of resources always kept coming to my mind. Like, you know, how can he continue to do the part-time work that he was doing? How can we afford groceries? Things like that. You know, those are things that I realized a lot of families of gun violence survivors go through. And so it was always in the back of my mind from that experience and how to make it better to bring more resources to the families that are dealing with gun violence. So fast forward to 2023. I was first-term legislator. As mentioned in my biography, I was a criminal defense attorney, and I was on Ways and Means Committee. So I thought, oh, wow, how do I mesh my two current worlds up? And so this idea came to mind to create a tax to deal with funding the trauma, gun violence, and gun violence intervention prevention programs. And it was inspired by the legislation that was passed in California, which I see in some nods, so you are somewhat familiar with the bill. But that bill was pretty encompassing as to all the pots of money that was necessary to address gun violence, particularly with the aftermath of gun violence. But I know us as Marylanders, we too value making sure that we're preventing gun violence, but we have to make sure our bill is Maryland reflective. It's not exactly cookie cutter of California. So I worked with now Congressman, not Congressman-elect anymore, but Congresswoman Sarah Elford. At that time that we worked together, she was the state senator from Anne Arundel County to work on this piece of legislation. We were not successful in getting to the finish line last year, but this year I am committed to making sure that we deal with the bill and hopefully get it passed out of the House. I'm looking for a Senate sponsor right now. But essentially, this bill this year is going to focus on just the excise tax on guns. Last year, it was a lot more expansive. We did guns, ammunition, and accessories. I wanted to kind of start small and narrow and make sure we at least got something on the books because we know it's going to get challenged. It's going to get challenged in California if it hasn't already. I just wanted to get something on the books to get us started in the funding. So essentially what this bill does is going to create 11% excise tax on the gross receipts of sales of firearms by the dealers. So if you're a federally licensed dealer in the state, you'll be responsible for collecting the excise tax. This particular funding source is going to cover the following, which is slightly different from last year. The Coordinated Community Supports Partnership Fund established under the Education Article, which essentially is blueprint funding for student behavioral health. It's also going to fund the Maryland Trauma Physician Services Fund, the Shock Trauma Center at the University of Maryland Medical System, the Maryland Violence Intervention and Prevention Program through the state, we call it GOCAP, but the Office of Crime Prevention. The Survivors of Homicide Victims Grant Program, also under the same agency. The new Center of Firearm Violence and Prevention and Intervention, which is under the Department of Health. And we are looking at the particular percentages right now, but the reason why we have started with those particular areas is that it's dealing with the aftermath of gun violence from the moment that action occurs, someone is shot and they go to shock trauma, to the families that are impacted by that traumatic incident, as well as, when I say families, I include the children as well. And that's something that was new this year. We were trying to figure out how to incorporate our youth last year, but this solution I think is more fitting to address the behavioral health challenges that can come with being traumatized by someone who's been impacted by gun violence in the family. Now, why those particular topics, those particular subjects under this piece of legislation? I've already addressed the student behavioral health issues, but the trauma is very important. I mean, last year we had a pretty much heavy emphasis on trauma because there was such a dire need to fund it. We've gotten some good solutions out of our work last year on the trauma fund, but the reason why we've kept this portion in the legislation again is that the number of gun violence victims in our shock trauma centers, they're taking up a significant amount of resources. And I think having that nexus is very important to address in this bill. Yes, there was legislation that deals with funding of it, but if we don't address the fact that, you know, next to slip and falls, gun violence is probably like the second or third highest cases, but they're there the longest. It's the more complicated injury to heal. So by definition, it is taking up a significant amount of resources. And we cannot let guns off the hook That's how I feel about it. Having the dealers responsible for collecting this tax and being part of the solution, I think is the missing piece of our puzzle right now in Maryland. We're talking about, holding individuals accountable, holding manufacturers accountable, but we're not talking about dealers. I mean, I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but, guns coming from like unlicensed dealers is a big problem here in Maryland. I know the Attorney General addressed it at some point in the last year. And one thing that was noted last year is that, when you purchase a gun legally, you might misuse it, right? You might be involved in intimate partner violence. So when there's conversations saying, go after the legal owners or the bad guys could be the good guys at the start of it all, right? And that's why it's necessary for us to consider just having this tax on the purchase generally. I always considered it a public health solution because gun violence remains to me always a public health crisis. When we're talking about the our Maryland economy and getting folks back to work, we can't forget the ones that have been impacted by trauma. And so if we can find ways to create a source of revenue to support the organizations and the agencies that support our survivors, that support our communities, that prevent the gun violence from happening even further, we're supporting our economy. I think that's just the bottom line for me. If we're supporting just our human capital in our communities, we're supporting our economy. And you might be hearing the news about all this talk about budget deficit and things like that. My solution, one of them is just let's get our families whole again so they can want to go back to work, desire to go back to work, and not stay in the funk of depression or confusion because of a traumatic event in their life. And so these are the reasons why, like, the violence intervention prevention program is also one of the pockets of work that we want to fund, as well as the Survivors of Homicide Victim Grants program. The Center for Firearm Violence and Prevention is a relatively new program because we just passed it last year, and I'm just starting conversations with the folks at that department as well. So my hope is that they are going to do a catch-all of all the things that we need to support our survivors of gun violence, as well as gun violence intervention work in the community. And so that's essentially it. I hope I didn't make tax too boring. I tried to I tried to personalize a little bit, but yeah, I just thank you for the opportunity to speak, and I'm happy to take any questions. I feel stronger doing that than just going on about taxes. I can go to the returns and all that good stuff, but thank you very much.
Right, so I'm the non-legislator, so I have copious notes. They just like, I don't know, successfully wing it, I guess. I am so in awe of that. All right, I'm also short, so will that, maybe not. Maybe it's just for tall people. Okay, there we go. Can you hear me? If you do it that way. Thank you. So hi, I'm Karen Herron. I'm the Executive Director of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence. So I usually don't go into a lot of detail about who I am because frankly, I don't think that's really all that important when we come to these conversations, but I'll give you a few minutes of that. So I came into this space of gun violence prevention shortly after Sandy Hook. When Sandy Hook occurred, I also had a first grader, that my youngest was a first grader, my oldest was in third grade. And like many of you, when certain news events happen and it just really connects with you for some reason, it really just unfloored me. And shortly after, like literally like 2 weeks later, my husband came home and he's like, "Yeah, I got this job opportunity out of the country." And I'm like, "Fantastic, let's go." I'm like, we'll go for 2 years, we'll come back and someone will have fixed this problem. And of course, 2 years go by and we came back and the problem wasn't fixed. I had many conversations with my young boys as they were re-entering American school system, because when you're in another country and you're hearing about what is happening in the United States, everyone is hearing it. And so they knew kids in the US were having lockdown drills, and that wasn't something they were used to. And they were going to have to do that. And mom, is it safe for us to go to school in the US? So we were having those conversations as they re-entered. And so I thought, I can't keep hoping that someone else is going to fix this. And so I started volunteering with Sandy Hook Promise at that point, created Start with Hello programs in my kids' schools, some Say Something programs as well, until eventually I connected with our state level organization, Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence. And I realized that, so much of gun policy is at the state level, that's where we have to be working the hardest to make a change, and somehow managed to volunteer my way into a full-time job. And so here I am many years later. So that's who I am and how I got into this space. I do have a law degree, so the policy part is sort of interesting from that perspective. But our state level organization, Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, is just that. It is state level. We don't have what I like to call a national overlord telling us what to do or what the national policy is. So we really get to take a look at what is going on in the state of Maryland and figure out what we think we need to work on to fix what's going on here, and work with our national partners as well, to try to make change and make a difference. So that's who I am. That's what my organization is. We do both advocacy and programmatic and educational work as well. I can talk about that all day long. I'll leave that for another day because this is about policy. But thank you to the team here at St. John's for all of your advocacy on gun violence prevention, as well as putting together this event today. Margaret, thank you for Senator Heddleman and Delegate Miracle North, and all the legislators who take on these bills, because even the simplest gun bill carries a complexity that is frequently not existent in many other areas of the law. Not only is there a spider web of federal and state laws to have to navigate, you have constitutional questions, you have the dynamics of the politics of guns, the shifting sands of equity and burden, and the one often overlooked aspect to me is gender inequality. So our priorities this year really focus on the things that we can do to prevent gun violence, which is what I like to focus on as much as we need to deal with the after effects of gun violence. When we can keep it from happening, obviously, that is the best case scenario. So as you've already heard, our two main priorities this year include addressing relinquishments. I have slides. They're not that explicit. I think you can I kind of forgot what I put up. There you go. That's what they are. Two main priorities this year include addressing the relinquishments of firearms in the domestic violence setting and funding violence prevention initiatives through the excise tax on guns. So you've already gotten an overview of these, but I'll try to go through a little bit more to help enlighten you as to where we are. The gun industry would have you believe that firearms are the great equalizer, and that many people choose firearms as their primary mode of self-defense. The data actually tells us, though, that whenever firearms are added into the equation, the outcomes are generally worse for everyone involved. This is never more true than it is for women. When a woman chooses to arm herself, the most likely outcome, statistically speaking, is that the firearm will be used against her. And when the person she is trying to protect herself from is in her own home, the statistics are even more stark. Whenever an abuser has access to a gun, it is 5 times more likely that an abusive partner will kill his female victim. We know that domestic violence is a strong predictor of gun violence outside of the home as well. And while federal and state laws prohibit domestic abusers from possessing firearms, Maryland falls short in ensuring that these individuals actually relinquish their firearms. This gap is one of the many reasons, or one of the few reasons, there aren't many, that Maryland consistently receives an A- rather than an A from the Giffords Law Center when they're ranking our gun laws. So to address this issue, Senator Shelley Heddleman and Delegate Sandy Bartlett are introducing legislation aimed at strengthening firearm relinquishment in the context of the Domestic Violence Protective Order. This bill would make gun surrender mandatory earlier in the process, establishing some clear deadlines, and as the senator has already pointed out, exploring the possibility of creating statewide procedures to ensure dangerous individuals don't slip through the cracks. So that's what that bill is. We think that it's very important. We know that domestic violence is a great driver of gun violence generally. There is a very strong link between mass shootings starting or being interconnected in some way with domestic violence. So this intersection is a critically important piece to address. The other bill is the Comprehensive Community Safety Funding Act, so that we're not always referring to it as a tax bill. You may have seen some of the recent press about gun violence and violent crime numbers in both the nation and the state. Recent FBI reports indicate that violent crime nationwide has actually decreased by an estimated 3% in 2023 compared to the previous year. Specifically, murder and non-negligent manslaughter saw an estimated nationwide decrease of 11.6%. Early data for 2024 shows that this downward trend has actually continued. Since 2021, statewide homicides are down 32%. Baltimore City, which saw 201 homicides in 2024, that was a 41% decrease from the prior year. There are a lot of reasons that this is happening, and we can't just point to any one and say that it's happening for this reason. But critically, there has been a coordination between local, state, and federal organizations communicating, working together, getting the funding where they need to go to make sure that the things that need to happen are happening, whether that is law enforcement, whether that is violence intervention and prevention, whether that's hospital-based stuff. As we head in realistically into this next administration federally, there is a real fear that the dollars that are going into making things happen that work are going to be going away. And we need to find sustainable funding sources that are not tied to the political whims of the day and that we know will increase and decrease with the need. We know that more guns equals more gun violence, and so it follows that more gun sales equals more gun violence, and therefore more gun violence prevention dollars. So to that end, Delegate Miracle North is introducing legislation that would place an excise tax on the profits of firearm sales that would go to fund various initiatives designed to address and prevent gun violence. Only a couple of states have tackled this so far, so we are excited to be among the front runners in this work. So, I guess that really gets me to why you're here and what you would like to get from this and ways that you can be involved and help get these bills over the finish line. I think we can advance the slide. Just go ahead and move past that to the next one where contact information, I think, comes up. That works. All right. So there are all kinds of ways you can be involved. Different things work for different people. So I'm going to throw a lot out at you and feel free to email me later or ask me again to repeat these things. So Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence will have a virtual kickoff on January the 23rd at 6 p.m. This event will be recorded, so you can always watch it later if you can't make that evening. So that's January 23rd at 6 p.m. Our partners at Moms Demand Action will host their annual rally and lobby day in Annapolis on January 30th, and that is always a wonderful event. So if you've never been and you are interested in going to Annapolis to do these things, they do a great job organizing that and pulling all of that together. So I strongly encourage you to sign up for that. Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence is also launching this year a couple virtual lobbying events. This is new to us, so you'll have to bear with us if it doesn't work super smoothly at first. We're trying to figure out what's going to work. But for those folks who either don't want to trek to Annapolis or in the dead of winter because it's cold outside, or that's hard to do, or you just want to do more, this is a Zoom-based call. We will set it. We have it set up that I can't tell you what we're going to talk about right now because I don't know what that's going to be, but closer to the event, we'll decide this legislators need to hear this, like whatever that is. We'll provide lists of contact information. You can get on the phone and call their offices. You can send emails. You can sit on the call and do it. You can get the information and do it on your own time. But we're going to host 2 of those. One for February 11th at 1 p.m. and another for February 27th at 3 p.m. Trying to get to different times a day for folks, but be on the lookout for that, and certainly email me if you want more information about how to sign up for those. And then if you haven't already, go to our website at www.mdpgv.org and follow the links to sign up for our newsletter, where we'll keep you up to date on all of these things, any action alerts, how to sign up for events, anything that is going to be happening during the session. And in the coming weeks, we will have bill fact sheets. I'm still working on them now. I keep changing them because we keep changing what we're doing. So I didn't want to give them out today quite yet. But we'll share those both through our newsletter and on our websites, on our main priorities. So be on the lookout for those. And of course, once the bill hearings are set, you can choose to submit written testimony. If you have a compelling, relevant story that you wish to tell, you can always come in person and give oral testimony. That's always very effective. I've laid out, if you really want to dive deeply into some of the issues, we've got some longer policy papers, one on women and guns and domestic violence, and another one on something I'm not talking about because we don't have a legislative sponsor, but it's on the handgun roster board. So feel free to learn about that because we really need to work on that. But really, seriously, every email, every outreach, it all really makes a difference. And none of us could do this work without the input of the constituents around the state of Maryland. So I thank you for being here today, taking time off to talk about gun violence on a Sunday. So I really appreciate it. And that's what I have.
Well, those were 3 terrific talks, and I'm really happy that we're on schedule. We have 15 minutes for questions. But because we're trying to keep in touch with our Zoom audience, if you have a question, you do have to come up here and speak into this microphone to share your question. And then whoever you're asking, oh, Jay will take the
I can take the
microphone.
microphone to them, but we have 2 questions off of Zoom.
2 questions. All right, tell us what the questions
I
are.
think they're both for the delegate, and it was from Lori Solomon. Can you say again, please, what the excise tax will fund and what's the exact name of the bill?
The Comprehensive Community Safety Funding Act. That was a collective effort to create that nice name because tax just doesn't sound sexy. Let me get the exact pools of money. Okay, so the 5 categories are the Coordinated Community Supports Partnership Fund, the Maryland Trauma Physician Services Fund, the R. Adams Crowley Shock Trauma Center at the University of Maryland, the Maryland Violence Intervention and Prevention Program Fund, the Survivors of Homicide Victims Grant Program, and the Center for the Firearm Violence Prevention and Intervention. So those are the 6 categories. And was there a third question or?
No, that was it.
That was it. Okay. Okay.
But we have a question back here.
Okay.
Thank you guys for coming. Appreciate this topic. I guess my question is for these bills, I mean, is there a fear that they're not going to pass? Because I don't mean to sound tongue in cheek when I say this, but you've got a Democratic governor, Attorney General, Secretary of State. The Senate is controlled by the Democratic Party. The House is controlled by the Democratic Party. Typically, Maryland is progressive in these types of things. So I think it's called like a trifecta. You guys have the whole gambit. So where is there potential resistance to this, very specifically? And I mean, is the expectation that these pass? And if they don't, then I think we should know who and why they don't. And is there a way to try to push that forward and get awareness to that? That's my question.
So you want my answer or like the politically correct answer? I'm still new, so I still have to like find that file. The political will is the hurdle. It takes time to fight the gun lobbyists. It takes energy to to deal with that. We have 90 days. We have 90 days. So, um, you know, I, I was trying to get the bill taken care of sooner in terms of getting it filed, because the sooner we do it, the sooner we go through this hurdle, and we can still have time before crossover, which is halfway before session ends, to sort of the details. That I foresee is going to be the hurdle this year. The reason why I did, particularly with guns, it's just less to argue, right? It's just literally less time to address. I actually have another colleague that has been talking to me about doing a bill on the ammunition. He's just kind of floating the idea. I said, "You have at it. Let's share the responsibility." So that's really what it is. It's not the fact that, because look, last year we passed the Center of Firearm Prevention. So it's not that we don't have the desire. And then last year we also did a lot of, we did 2 gun bills, which took up a lot of time. So that's going to be our hurdle. And if we get all of you talking to your legislators, 'cause I know it's a variety of folks represented here, to keep pushing them, bring it up, that helps, because that gives everybody else besides us more political will to say, look, we got to address this. So that's why your advocacy is so important. It increases our will to do the work.
I'll just add a little bit. When I first came over to the Senate in 2020, I was put on the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. And that is where all these gun bills go, right? So the Delegate America North's bill was also jointly referred to because it's a tax, to the JPR and the Senate and the Budget and Tax Committee, which is actually, I serve on that committee. And in the House, in the Budget, in the Judiciary Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, right? Were they jointly referred? Just Ways and Means. Interesting. So, judicial proceedings, I'll just speak from my own experience there, is it deals with a lot of very complicated and emotional issues, and including all of the gun bills, all of the criminal justice issues, all of police reform, all of much of the housing bills. For whatever reason, that jurisdiction falls under in their bailiwick. And so they are often competing for time. As the delegate said, it's 90 days. The other issue, and this isn't relevant for your bill, but it is relevant for this bill, is cost. I have done in years past a couple of other bills, and because the devil is in the details in these bills, and they are very complicated often. And the enforcement piece and the accountability piece has to be shared among many different systems and complex systems. Criminal justice system, the law enforcement system, the courts, the sheriffs, local government, state government, and then you have federal law on top of all of this. And you're talking about a constitutionally protected right. And so while we all, as Democrats, and it's in our party platform, are interested in ensuring that we are advancing gun safety legislation, the devil is in the details here. And if it, especially this year, involves more people that the agency needs to enforce, that makes the fiscal note go up. And we have already been told, and this is a challenge every year, but especially this year when we're coming in with a $3 billion shortfall, that anything with a substantial fiscal note is DOA. So that's why we're working to make sure to keep our fiscal note as low as possible.
Following up on that question, okay, so we get through Maryland, and our third speaker talked about how we don't want to answer to our federal overlords, and but the problem is we don't have the greatest track record with federal judges like overturning Maryland's well-meaning and well-fought-for gun bills, and so how do how do we avoid like we were here last year and Maryland fought for the ammunition bills and then they get overruled by federal judges, and it's such a frustrating process, that. And then the other thing on the tax bill, how do we avoid the same thing that happened with the gambling industry or the alcohol industry? Okay, so they pay a small tax, and then are we legitimizing the process through that? I guess is how do we avoid that?
I'm going to turn this over to my attorney partners here. But I do want to say one thing. I mean, in terms of federal, we were watching very closely the Supreme Court's decision this summer on the Rahimi case, which dealt with whether we could remove firearms in cases of domestic violence. And we were very pleasantly surprised that the court said, after we went through Bruin and after we went through another decision, I'm blanking on, okay, Bruin was the big one, but that, the strange legal rationale that they used in the Bruin case, they did not, there was room to enable the removal of firearms. So that was something that we were very, very nervous about, very, very scared about, and pleasantly surprised that we can still do that. As far as your other questions, I'm going to pass it over. I'll turn it to you after that.
So first of all, let me just clarify. When I say my national overlord, that I don't have that, it's because so many of our organizations, when I'm talking nonprofit organizations, have a national platform that they have to answer to. And as a state level nonprofit organization, I don't have that. So not that I don't have to, that we don't have to look to federal law or what's going on in the US government to guide what we're doing. So just that clarification. And look, there's a lot of emphasis. Obviously, most of these bills end up in court being challenged in some way, shape, or form. And there's always a lot of emphasis on what doesn't make it, right? Like we did sensitive places a couple years ago, and there was a court case that came out that said that there was a couple of pieces in that law that were not going to hold with that Bruin decision. And so they took it out of our state law. Most of that law still stands. People focus on the fact that we lost 2 pieces of it, but I think more like 13 pieces became law in our law today. So, largely we're doing okay. The Rahimi decision, which focused on domestic violence and that intersection between gun violence and domestic violence, really is driving the work that we're working on when it comes to firearm relinquishments. And then there's a body of law that is building and growing around the extreme risk protective orders that we passed a couple of years back, or a few years back now. And most of those are holding firm. Certainly, I'm not sure, I don't think ERPO's landed in the Supreme Court yet, but those laws are being upheld. And there's a very similar sort of framework for why those laws are important and why what we're doing with the domestic violence protective order. So, we're not going to win everything. We're not going to agree with the courts on everything, but largely we're doing okay even in this setting. Do I wish we would be doing slightly better? Of course, but it isn't all gloom and doom, I think. And then I already blanked, but I know that the next part of it was something I thought you could answer better than me.
Yeah, as a practicing lawyer, I feel like you're giving me a chance to do oral arguments. I was I was looking at the actual bill. This is also inspired by the Pittman-Robinson Wildlife Restoration Act, which is a federal law that provides funding for wildlife conservation, restoration, hunter education. That's current law, and so this 11% excise tax, we should be funding ourselves, like as humans. We've talked about funding wildlife. We have to fund our communities. And so when I looked at the potential legal arguments, I remember last year, what really hit home for me is that as long as these taxes are tied to a specific purpose, this whole notion of one's gun rights being violated, it's a pretty weak argument. And that's the case nationwide. And that's including I think counties or cities that have done similar, like fees instead of taxes, as long as they tie it to a particular purpose, it has been upheld. So I definitely, share your concerns about, like, what if this is all for that once it gets to the court level. But I guess being a practicing attorney, I prepare for these bills. I prepare like it's going to Supreme Court. And so I can be really dirty about it, but that's essentially, how I'm approaching these bills and why, for instance, I am starting with the gun tax because the ammo tax was a little murky last year in terms of the argument. So I hope I hope you all answered your question there. Great.
Hi, it's almost exactly 11 o'clock. Okay, make it
Sorry.
quick.
Hi, I will. So I'm Jan Donahoe McNamara. Many of you people know me. A lot of you know that I lost my brother-in-law, John McNamara, in the mass shooting at the Capitol Gazette in 2018. And to the excellent point, I'm so glad we're having this conversation as why are we bothering and how hard is it? The perpetrator of the Gazette mass shooting was a convicted stalker. He was still able to legally get a gun. The laws that were in place that allowed that to happen, there were two main ones, they were trying to fight those laws before the Gazette happened. And after the Gazette happened, they still didn't pass. In 2019, they did not pass. They have passed now. So to the point about the domestic violence link being very strong, it's really there. To the delegate's point that we cannot let the gun dealers off the hook, I say that's really strong because that was a legal purchase. But my daughters were 9 and 11 when I had to tell them that their uncle died because he went to work that day. My husband was with their mother waiting for the news. They are now 18 and 16. So I get this question a lot as to why, and why are we doing this? And I will just sort of say, it's a slog, honestly, but it's worth doing because those laws have passed. Other laws have passed. Margaret mentioned Jalen's law. That is named after a 15-year-old girl who went to school and was shot in the head by a boy who she turned down. That law was also suggested before she died, and it didn't pass until last year, but it has passed now. So for all of those reasons, I will just say it's a slog, but it's the only way I can look at my kids in the eye. So with that in mind, I would love for all of you who can, and I know it's hard, to get to Advocacy Day on January 30th. I will say those of us who live in Montgomery County, especially District 16 and 17, they are very supportive. So it's a good time. It's not a hard time. They're happy to see us. They're happy to listen. But making sure that that group that gets that big group picture on the steps when we're allowed to do that, or elsewhere when there's construction, that group is as big as possible is hugely important. For those other counties that are not as friendly to this idea, and they're out there, believe me, and I've met a lot of them. It's been very eye-opening over the last 6 years. That's another story, we can talk. So I would just say, please do this. It's really important, and it really does work, but not overnight. So thank you all so much for coming here.
Thank you, Jan. Jan, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry what happened to you and your family. And that's one reason that I'm doing what I'm doing and that we're here today. So we're about to adjourn. I know many of you need to go to the next service, but I do have one request, and that is to please get involved and try to help us get these two bills passed. Please talk to the people. There's Stephanie Clipper and Tom Kennedy are going to be out here. Jan's going to be in here with people from Moms Demand sorry, I'm getting my group, Moms Demand Action. Karen's going to be right here. And I have to say, Karen's group is really doing a great job with advocacy. I'm so glad I started working more closely with them as well as moms. So our meeting is adjourned. Thank you.